Back to you, Mr. Chaudhury.
Coming back to the crisis that we are in, I think the advisory role of independent directors assumes special significance, especially in these times when companies have to decide between survival at any cost and knowing that there may not be much of tomorrow. What should the role of independent directors be in these times, Sukanya?
See, the only thing about a crisis we should understand is that it will go away. The point is that you have to therefore figure out all crises in the past have gone away. So fundamentally, what we have to say is, how can we hold the company together, get through the crisis so that we are stronger at the end of it?
Yep.
Stronger brands do better during crisis. There are many worldwide brands that have been born during crisis. So the issue is really, you have to help the company steer your way out of the crisis. And it could be by bringing in what I call outside-in thinking. Sometimes you say, have you looked at this? Are you sure you're doing this? Now, today what's happened is, with all board meetings getting recorded, some discussions happen offline. And therefore you actually, some of the boards I'm on actually fix an hour one-on-one every quarter for an hour to discuss, okay, is there something you want to contribute to, question you're uncomfortable with? Is there anything you can add value to? Is there something that you wanted to say? So either you pick up the phone and talk to the management, or they speak to you if they're doing something, or if you smell an opportunity to, say, pivot in some ways or digitize in some ways and look at business models differently. But yes, you do bring in an outside-in thinking, which should help.
So, Sunandan, when the crisis started in month of March, the first question was, we need to have all our employees safe. And management and boards were working on, do we have the right insurance? Are we covered, all employees? Can they work from home? Do we have enough infrastructure to set up and work from home? The feeling was, oh, this is a blip, it'll pass in 3-4 weeks. Come April, the realization became much more that this is not going to go away in a month or so. It may be longer, and that's where the whole world was heading. And then the question became, we need to survive this crisis. I think the survival is now for a longer period, because it's about, are you going to be relevant during this period and continue some form of business? What is your cash flow going to look like? What is your capital, and how, and your, how's your balance sheet looking and your P&L looking? How many months will you survive? Do you need to raise capital to survive? That became an April-May conversation. So we went from employees being safe, can the company be safe? Can it survive this crisis? What if the crisis is till November? What if the crisis is till March? What if the crisis is for 18 months? How do we raise the capital? Where do we get the cash from? And then the whole equation shifted in month of June, when the economy started opening up, to say which lines of business should we focus on to give, which will give us business. And that has become a very critical thing, because some of your star products are not being purchased. They are irrelevant in today's environment, and people are just not wanting to purchase those. So what are the options if your star products are not what the market is going to buy given the current situation? You take Yatra.com. For Yatra, nobody is traveling. Their star product is only air tickets and planning your travel and getting your hotel bookings. And nobody across the globe is traveling, and 90% of your business is there. So how are you going to survive till it happens? And that became, I need to revive my business by focusing on what can take me through. So I look at it a period of survival, then revival, and it's the revival which is going on. And I think if we are able to come to what will help us revive our business, I think then we'll come to what will help us thrive in our business. The thriving stage hasn't come as yet, but I'm hopeful that some of the new initiatives which businesses have taken will help them revive. So the board role changed from employees to capital to cash to now reviving strategies, and let's hope we reach thriving strategies.
Yeah, many companies have relooked at their business models in this context as well.
Yeah, we have to
Three.
believe there is no capital. So
Yeah.
that's how it
So,
is.
I just to, I think summarize, and I agree with what Neelam has said and what Kripalu has also said. I'm sorry, I forgot your first name, so I'm using your surname.
Sukanya.
Sukanya. So you're absolutely right. Crisis is like where we are at the present moment. It's all cyclical. The issue is you don't know when it is going to end. And therefore, I think, what Neelam said is that in the April, May, all of us were busy trying to figure out how long is this cycle going to be? Where are we in the cycle? What are the different phases? And she sort of summarized it very well. And then try and establish what do we need to do through each one of these cycles. The second point I think is very, very important is the fact that you also have to do some scenario planning. Which is the best case, what is the most likely case, and what is the worst case scenario. And typically, normally, even when we were part of management, we used to take the worst case scenario and plan our costs and expenses based on that. While obviously we try to do the moderate scenario or the best case scenario as far as revenue was concerned. So I think, those two areas are very, very important. But I think there's a question of the how. What is the role which we can play in that? And I think number one is that, as independent directors, we can't wait for board meetings. So we have to make ourselves available. I remember in the case of SBI, there were some challenges in terms of the, just think about it. We have BCPs, we have disaster recoveries, we spent huge amounts of money on technology. Everything worked fine. Except that if we had to get an operator into a data center, he couldn't find a means of transport. So therefore, all of a sudden, all the, big planning which you didn't take care of something like a pandemic. Your contact center, people couldn't get to the contact center. So it took some time and you had to move equipment out, and there were regulatory requirements based on that. So you have to make yourself available to work with the management to solve some of those issues and some of those problems. So I think keeping yourself available, and like I think Kaushik also mentioned, frankly, I found that what you can do between board meetings is more important than what you do in the board meeting. The board meeting, even if it is for 8 hours, you really don't get time to really, understand the details. And therefore, you have to do that preparatory work in between meetings also. The one point which I just wanted to highlight, especially during the pandemic, is that one of the key and most important two important roles for the board is one on risk management. All of a sudden, if let's say you had a certain method of providing loans to people and you were using past data, all of a sudden that past data is of no consequence. Because his future behaviors of the company or the individual would completely change given the new circumstances. So you could not look to the past to predict the future. And therefore, the management had to be cautious, had to be looked at, for example, the overall risk matrices by industry, by lender, just to make sure that we take into account what could be the likely situation going forward. So risk becomes important. The last area, which I just thought I'd touch upon, is that it's during these kinds of situations where the utmost vigilance from an ethics and integrity is important, because there is the opportunity for a lot of unsavory things to happen because of the pandemic, and therefore you have to be absolutely very clear in terms of compliance, internal audits, just to make sure that the business. There are no unexpected surprises which will be there. So I think this whole ethics should not take a backseat. There should be a lot more vigilance and a lot more focus, especially around risk management, audit, internal audit, as well as compliance.
Okay, I just want to ask. Yeah, go ahead, Sunandan, sir.
No, I just thought if Kaushik wants to add a few words in this.
Just two small ones. One is that what makes this pandemic completely different from anything else that we have faced in our living memory is this: this pandemic is more than a crisis, it's uncertainty. Because in a crisis, you can actually make models. You can actually evaluate your risk, and you can run different models and different variables and come to a conclusion. But this pandemic does not have any previous information, any previous model. So that's why you have the forecasts that every large organization is making about growth changes every month or every 3 months. So that's why no one's actually figured it out that how will this recovery happen. So that that's the macro, and in the micro, when you put that into a company strategy, that makes so many more variables come in. That's where the role as a director becomes so much more important, is where you actually come and give all the guidance and all collective wisdom that you can put in. And on the output side, what has happened is that I think since the pandemic, SEBI has required companies to report on the effect of COVID on them. And that is happening every month and every quarter. So you're statutorily evaluating the effect of COVID, and you're also doing it from a business perspective. But this is probably one of the most difficult things to do, because the variables are far too many. And Bhaskar is absolutely right, that this is the time in which, there's a famous saying after the Enron crisis in the US that came up, was said, only when the tide goes down that you know who was swimming naked. So when this crisis happens, you'll see NPAs going down, you'll see financial manipulations, you'll see fraud, all of these happening because companies want to conceal their financial position so that your loans don't get recalled, your investors don't actually to keep the investors away. So multiple things would happen, and so this is the time in which not only the business has to run, you have to sustain, you have to survive, and you have to grow, and also make sure that ethically or governance-wise you haven't slipped down, which actually takes the company back into dark ages.
Okay. I want to ask you a really tough one. And, in my view, it's a tough one. It could not be boards are very involved sometimes in hiring the management, the CEO, at least the top, MD, right? Now, you as a board member or a chairperson of a board has hired a CEO, and that CEO, he or she, hasn't done well. Tell us real situations, when you've been involved in recruiting of the CEO, but it hasn't worked out like that. What is the kind of direction the board has taken? And what is the kind of input you have given? We can start with Bhaskar.
So first of all, I've never faced that situation. And if I had to face that situation, I'd have first got to check with the PMO. But, luckily that
okay. You're talking about your board member, Jim.
So I think, the situation is different. I think in the, so far, all the boards I've been in, I've actually found that the CEOs have been really very good, very strong leaders. And especially, I think during this time of the pandemic, the whole objective is to support them and, work with them. So I haven't had this situation, so I don't know how I will respond. I mean, when I was the head of, some of the previous companies I was in, very, how would I put it? Sacking somebody was not too difficult a task. The challenge is how do you do it without destroying somebody? Yeah. And I think that really is the challenge. How do you do it so that the person's exit is honorable, that the person finds a new opportunity elsewhere? I don't think it will be any different. But as a board member, I've never had that opportunity, or never faced that. I won't say opportunity, but never faced that.
Ms. Dhawan?
So it's the responsibility of the NRC to select the CEO. And, one of the boards I sit on, we went through very early an issue with when the CEO had to be asked to go on vacation, and then she was asked to, and then she left the organization. That's when I saw
the financial services.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So the NRC, and I chair the NRC for that particular organization, played an active role in first looking at who can be the successor. And having the conversation first is to say, we have to follow a process and we need to bring in a successor. And and then go to the regulator and have a conversation with the regulator to get the successor in place. Very clearly, at least in all the boards I am on, there's a board evaluation process, and the management members who are on the board are also part of the evaluation. And it's an annual process where you give feedback, not only to the NEDs, but you also give feedback to the management as to what the board thinks of you. And that falls on the lap of the chairman to give the feedback to the CEO, if required, at the end of a year or whenever the board evaluation is done, to say what does the board members think about where it's going, where is he doing well, where he's not doing well. And this has, on the boards I sit on, this is followed thoroughly in every board. So I think NRC plays a big role. The CEO appointment is always with a discussion with the board. I have not seen a CEO appointment, at least in the one case I saw, we were discussions, and there's consistent feedback. Like Bhaskar, I have not been in a situation where we have asked a CEO to go.
Okay. Ms. Kripalu?
So in my case,
and especially, let me add a variation. You know, when you're selecting a CEO, sometimes there is no unanimity. How do you deal with that? You know, typically someone gets hired because one person becomes the champion for hiring that person, he or she, right? So if there's no unanimity, how do you handle that?
So there are two things. One is, as Neelam mentioned, the role is very often that of the NRC. And it depends from organization to organization. In one of the organizations I worked with, the CEO hiring was completely the job of the NRC. But what we did do is, while we had recommendations, it was an MNC company. So we shortlisted a list of 2 people and then gave our pros and cons, and the list went up to their global parent company. They happened to choose what I call number 2 and not number 1 on our pecking order. And that led to, well, number 2 was also acceptable, which is why he was sent in the first place. But we went through this process of what were the reasons for choosing one over the other, culture fitment, etc., etc. So different people have different criteria to evaluate. Actually, as it happened, number 1 got chosen and became an excellent leader. So we never looked back. I had another experience where the chairman, where this was not a CEO we had hired, but this was a CEO which was clearly not functioning. So there the NRC got together in this so-called evaluation, pointed it out, worked with the chairman put something together, and then over a period of time, the gentleman concerned went on leave and then left, etc., etc. So there were 2 different experiences.
Okay, Mr. Dutta, have you ever faced a situation where you were a votary or a champion to get somebody to lead a company, and then that person wasn't working out, and you had to kind of course correct?
No, I did not. I haven't had a situation in which I championed for a CEO to join in. I can't. No, not in any of the boards in which I've been a director. But having said that, in another note is, see, most companies actually have got a promoter who's the entrepreneur, right? And irrespective of whatever is the independence of the NRC, like in the multinational company, you do need a nod from the majority owner, whichever form it comes. So there is a play that happens, whether we admit it or not, is to actually have the majority owner or their representatives on the board play a vital role in who actually becomes a CEO or a key management person or the successor.
Okay, back to you, Sunandan. Sunandan, I would like to ask you a question that, you as a headhunter, not only recruit senior management, CEOs, so on, you also recommend board, for preeminent boards, you bring in board members. So tell us, what is the process that goes in your mind? Is there a playbook to selecting one? Quick answer, Sunandan.
I think fundamentally it all depends on the brief. Right. And what is required at that point of time, and sometimes they're very specific in nature. I think we will have to go by the brief. So each one will be different from that point of view. And then look at somebody who fits the brief for that matter.
And when will
And
we
fits
get
in the
younger
company
people to be on
ethos.
boards?
Sorry?
When will we get sub 40-year age people to be on board? If you look at the average age of boards, it's, you know, it can be younger, let me put it. So, Sunandan, do you see that change happening post-COVID?
Well, I think, you know, lots of new age companies look at younger people. And I think this will come about because, you know, they want more of technology, people who are, you know, understand technology, know how to work well with technology and see how the technology is moving at the same time. So I think this will move, and this will bound to happen, especially in new age companies of today, you know.
Okay.
I have one last question, and before, I mean, there are quite a few
audience, 10
audience questions as well.
About 18 questions.
Yeah, you want, but before we take that, one question I had, because, you know, all the independent members over here and even otherwise are on various boards, and many boards simultaneously. I mean, does that help become impartial and ensure that companies do not resort to drastic survival measures or strategies in this kind of situation? Bhaskar?
Sorry, your question is that,
you know, being on several boards simultaneously, you get a sense of what's happening across companies. I mean, I'm sure that helps in terms of, you know, giving your counsel, especially when it comes to situations like this, you know, because they tend to be, many companies would, you know, resort to drastic survival strategies at this point of time.
So, you know, it's surprising, but, you know, whether I'm on the board or an advisory board, so far, at least the companies I've been associated with have all been, and I think it's thanks to the leadership, have been very optimistic. One. Number two is that the worst case scenarios that they have portrayed hasn't as yet come about. So therefore, all the necessary steps which were taken basically to outlast the pandemic seem to be going as per track. I think the green shoots of revival we seem to be seeing. So therefore, I think, you know, I have not seen anybody saying that we are going to lay off people. There's been salary cuts. There have been no promotions. They've obviously not giving bonuses. But I have not seen anybody taking very dramatic or drastic action, either to shut down parts of the business or to lay off employees, or any other action of that nature, at least in the 4 or 5 different companies I'm with.
Right. Sukanya?
So typically your role, if you've been on many boards, is actually to try and bring in best practices if you've heard of any. And it comes spontaneously. It's not something that you plan for. But I agree that as a principle, organizations, what have they done? They've done during the crisis, they first protect their own people. And what do I need to do to protect the people that I have on board? Whether it is on the salary front, whether it is on long-term employment, whether it is, frankly, even a very selfish nature that tomorrow if the business picks up, where will I go looking for people? My guys are the best guys. So if I want to hit the ground running, one of the thoughts is that I must have my people in place. And therefore, the first thing you can do when you come from one board to the other is to say, hey, don't let go. For example, in a crisis like this. So you share best practices and see how you can weather the crisis. But at the end of the day, all the businesses I'm on have a future. So I'm not talking of businesses which will not, quote unquote, survive. So if you know they have a future, you actually need to share best practices to make sure they ride the storm.
Yeah. No, this is a question, this is something which is close to my heart, and I want Neelam to also respond to this, because I'm a strong believer and protagonist in terms of diversity of experience. And I think many of you can bring that to the table, right?
Yes, and I agree with what Sukanya said. The diversity of thought which comes in because you are on multiple boards and interacting with various industries also becomes the value add you bring into a discussion. As rightly discussed in the previous question you asked, this pandemic nobody had seen. And when a CEO, even a CEO or a chairman has not seen it. So sometimes when they say, so should we do X? And you're given a fair example or input and say, yes, I think so, because this is how others are looking at it. And, I definitely think being on diverse, I wouldn't say diverse boards, doing diverse roles helps you get that perspective.
Yep. Kaushik?
The good thing is that most of the boards that all of us sit in are fairly large companies. So
Yeah.
they have the wherewithal and they have the critical mass and size to get over the pandemic, because it's going to get over. It's a cycle. We don't know exactly when, but that's the role of the directors and the management to make sure that we weather the storm. And seeing many events and many boards, many decisions, many variables, just makes you that much little bit more wiser from the point of view of perspectives that you have and that you share, and hopefully that you come to a collectively a good answer to a problem that we only know that whether the answer was correct only 3 months later. So you do the best you can under the circumstances, because uh, it's fairly difficult and fairly unknown. So we are all making best judgment calls at this point of time.
In fact, just thought I'd share.
Yeah.
I was talking to a very close friend and who's also was a successful CEO, and then he's been on the board of different companies. So both of us were reminiscing that we thank our lucky stars that we retired before the pandemic hit. Because anybody who's running operations is having a tougher time. It's easy to sit on the board to give
Yeah.
advice and to give moral
Absolutely.
support and to ask
Absolutely.
the right
Yeah.
questions. But for the
Yeah.
people and the CEOs and the managements which are running companies under such adverse circumstances, you have to give them credit.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Coming to the questions, there are quite a few questions, so I don't know whether we can take all of them today, and maybe we can do a few. Anurag, you want to start with something? One of my colleagues, Dr. Harshvardhan Bhave, has asked a question which I think has already been answered in the last question that was asked. How many times are boards involved in hiring the leadership team for the organization? How often is it? I mean, I think partly answered, but how often is it? Neelam?
I've seen it's always. So my experience is limited to few boards, but it's the board is always involved in the CEO selection.
Right. There's another question.
By law, it's always through the NRC and the board.
Yeah.
Very good.
And I want to ask a question to Kaushik Da, which is a question that has come in different shape and sizes on the chat and on the Zoom chat and on the QA. It's about, I don't think it happens on the kind of boards Ms. Kripalu, Mr. Pramanik, Ms. Dhawan, and Mr. Dutta are on, but they're talking about financial governance, diversion of funds. They're saying, why have the boards failed? And they're giving examples like Satyam happened many years back. And sadly, sorry, I have to say, ICICI, for some, there is a perception that, ICICI could have done better. And a lot of other companies that we still don't know. So people are talking about the role of SEBI. How can the role of SEBI be better? Recently, there was a ruling by the Supreme Court that the 4 accounting firms, SEBI doesn't have a jurisdiction on them. So how do you because you come from that kind of background, that's why I'm asking this question. How do you make sure that the accounting firms are held more accountable when it comes to financial governance?
You see, I mean, there are gatekeepers to the entire governance process and the financial process. So the first gatekeeper is the management, who actually prepares the financial statements, that set the controls. Then it comes to the board and the audit committee, which actually is a supervisory. Then the third level comes the internal auditors. Then you have the auditors. Then you have rating agencies. Then you have regulators. So you have a plethora of people who oversee or who are the gatekeepers to a company. And obviously there would be, at some point of time, something would fail. It's a question of at what level it failed, and you have to pick up responsibilities and set responsibilities. It's not a question of it's not going to fail. If you have a system, it will fail. But is there consequences on failure? In previous times, if you had a large fraud, very often there would be no consequences. But today, the way the Companies Act is defined, there is sections like 447, which actually brings in criminal liabilities on the directors for approving those financial statements which have a fraud. So what has happened now is there's a lot more scrutiny. There is a lot more, like you said, compliance. There is a lot more rigor. There is a lot more effort that at every level people put in, because now it's no longer a civil liability, which was there in the other part of, in the earlier Companies Act. Now you have a criminal liability. So that's where, you have to stand out and you have to do everything. Like I earlier said, the duty of care and your duty of loyalty. Fraud will happen. As long as human being is there, there will be greed, there will be fraud. But the question is that, have you done enough to prevent it? And that's the question each board has to answer, that we have done enough from our position to detect. But it still could happen that detection process failed. But you did everything under your control. That's the only answer we can get.
Okay. So Sunandan, all yours.
I just want to ask you, we've overshot the time, and all of us are conscious of it. And I know with senior management, everybody is conscious. So do we have time for a question or two? Shall we take one or two questions?
If you had to pick Parul Pandey's question, I think she worked with Mr. Pramanik.
That's right.
Of course, praising her. But our question is, you've been senior leaders within the management structure. I mean, before you got onto the boards, that's what she means. Now, when you look at issues in organizations that you would have handled in a particular way, what internal dialogue do you experience? Are there insights about your point of view having evolved over time? So has your own internal dialogue matured, and as you've gone on, has it changed in a way? That's what Parul Pandey is asking.
No, absolutely. That's a great question. I think, when I went on to the boards of different companies, when you're management, or especially when you're the CEO, you get various different inputs. You decide on a course of action, and then you say, let's go out and execute. A lot of it is based upon your own experiences, etc., because you're listening to people's views, but sometimes you choose a course of action which is perhaps unique to you, and only time will tell whether that's correct or not. The moment you're on the board of a company, one thing is very clear: you never tell management what to do. You have to be very cognizant of the fact, and therefore, if you have a different perspective, you must share that perspective, but it is their choice. Because finally, at the end of it, they are accountable for the execution. And therefore, you can only ask the right questions. You can point out and check with them if they've taken those relevant facts into account. But at the end of it, good or for bad, that is their choice. And then the only recourse you have is that if they've taken the wrong decision multiple times and the consequences are bad, then you replace the management. That's the prerogative of the board.
Okay. I think, Sunandan, we should take closing comments from everyone and kind of wrap up.
Absolutely.
Other questions are repetitive, unless until you want to ask a few things.
No, I think we are okay. I think let's have the closing comments. Absolutely.
So let's start with Ms. Dhawan first this time.
So I firmly believe that even in the COVID times, the board has an evolving role, and it has been being played by all of us, and we talked about it. It is changing rapidly as to what we do. And I also agree with what Bhaskar said in the end, is we can give advice and guidance. And I look at all advice and guidance are like gifts. Somebody said this to me: all advice and guidance are like gifts. If you like them, you use them. If you don't like them, toss it out.
Okay, very nice.
Right. Yeah.
Mr. Dutta?
No, it was great to be in this panel. Only one comment is, though we advise and we give our guidance to the board, to the company and its management on strategic matters and different business matters, but when it comes to governance, there are times you actually have to say no. I can't do this, and that's where you did, and that's where you put down. That's what all responsible board members do. Is when it comes to governance, there are things that are not done, and then you would actually say it's not done. So it's not always guidance. There are times you'll actually say it's a no.
Mr. Pramanik.
So I think this is a time for the board also to be very, very strategic. And to quote Winston Churchill, never let a good crisis go to waste. Therefore, I'm always looking at all the various boards I'm in, if there is something which we can get out of this, pandemic.
Yeah.
Turn problems into opportunities. Good.
Yeah.
Ms. Kripalu, you have the final word on this.
So I think a lot has been said, and clearly we as independent directors can add value, both on the governance front, where we must ask the right questions. I'm a great believer that we have to ask the hard questions and not shy away from that. Having said that, we do have to understand that our job is really to ask questions and point people in the right direction. Our job is not really to run the company. And there's a fine line difference between the two. So we have to help the company both strategically and by asking the right governance questions. But when it comes to actually implementation, we have to leave it to the management to decide.
Good. Thank you. Mr. Chaudhury, your final comment and we can wrap up.
No, I think we've had a fabulous discussion this evening. And I think we've discussed at length, especially in times of crisis, what the board really has to do, does, as well as what's doing right now. And I must thank all of you.
I just wanted to ask, do you miss the dinners after the board meeting and the drinks, or you don't miss them?
It's interesting you mentioned that. Very often, a lot of informal chatter actually happens at those dinners or lunches, which you don't do in a board meeting. So you actually get, as somebody mentioned earlier, you get a lot of stuff outside the boardroom as much as you do inside the boardroom.
Yes.
And like I think Sukanya mentioned earlier as well, everything is recorded right now. So you can't even do that informal chat as well. Anyway.
Sukanya, I'll give you a tip. Most of the video conferencing, whether it's WebEx, Zoom, or Team, they actually have the ability to do private chats.
Okay.
With individual members. So you can do the chatting while you're talking at the same time.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you so much. Sunandan.
Thank you so much, Bhaskar. Thank you, Neelam. Thank you, Sukanya. And thank you, Kaushik. It was wonderful having you there. And thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. Sorry for going beyond 8 o'clock. And I'm sure everyone who has watched enjoyed it as well and learned a lot. Thanks once again.